NewYorkBIO hosted our first ever Patient Engagement Summit in April 2021, bringing together leaders from industry, advocacy organizations, and patients and caregivers for an event centered on the role and voice of the patient in biotech innovation. We'd like to thank our sponsors, including our presenting sponsor, Pfizer, our panel sponsors, Semaphore, Circuit Clinical, Ovid Therapeutics, and Bristol Myers Squibb, as well as Alexion, Horizon, Lexeo Therapeutics, and UCB. We're also fortunate to have several patient organization partners, including the American Cancer Society's Cancer Action Network, the AMED Alliance, the Allergy and Asthma Network, the Arthritis Foundation, the Association of Oncology Social Work, the Autoimmune Registry, the Children's Tumor Foundation, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, the International Pain Foundation, the Lupus and Allied Diseases Association, the National Eczema Association, New York Oncology and Hematology, Patients Rising, Sickle Cell Thalassemia Patients Network, and Stronger Than Sarcoidosis. Our final panel of the day discussed the emergence of CAR-T and gene therapies, sponsored by Bristol Myers Squibb, and featuring Jarrell Martin from Bristol Myers Squibb, Jay Barth from Lexeo Therapeutics, Jeremy Griffin from the New York City Hemophilia chapter, and moderated by Alice Pomponio of Bright Edge, the philanthropic venture fund of the American Cancer Society's Cancer Action Network.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you've had a wonderful conference so far. Thank you for staying with us and joining for the final panel, which, as Derek mentioned, is the impact of CAR-T and gene therapies, a really timely topic, not only for health systems providers, but especially for patients who are trying to navigate this really rapidly evolving landscape. As you mentioned, my name is Alice Pomponio. I'm the managing director of Bright Edge, American Cancer Society's Venture Impact Fund, where we invest in early stage for-profit oncology companies to accelerate ACS's mission of reducing cancer mortality by 40% by 2035. And before I joined this impact investment role, I spent many years in medicines development and market access, public policy, and innovation. So I definitely recognize how disruptive technologies have these pain points across the system. In fact, even started my career in gene therapy in Richard Mulligan's lab at the Whitehead Institute, Viagene out in San Diego, as well as working on Carticel Macy, which was one of the first autologous cartilage cell therapy transplantations in our marketplace. I am here by a really esteemed group of panelists who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves, and I will start with Jarrell Martin from Bristol Myers Squibb. Jarrell, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Alice. Jarrell Martin here of Bristol Myers Squibb. I am a cell therapy clinical specialist at BMS based in Southern California, where I'm responsible for managing the product handling and administration for two of the CAR-T products that we're working with multiple institutions down the West Coast. Before I became here, I worked in patient education, clinical education, as well as patient engagement, as well as apheresis when it comes to the technical aspect. And glad to be here to help answer your questions appropriately and, of course, compliantly. And I'll turn it back over to you, Alice.
Thanks, Jarrell. Great to have you on the panel. Let me ask Jeremy to please introduce yourself. Jeremy?
Hi, everybody. It's Jeremy Griffin, the Executive Director of the New York City Hemophilia Chapter. I didn't realize I was a patient advocate until much later in my life, but it's something that was a big part of me very early on. I lost a friend to HIV whenever I was in junior high, and it kind of started me on a journey of getting involved with the AIDS teen peer educators. I went and brought the AIDS memorial quilt to my college. I went on alternative spring break to an AIDS hospice. So very early on, I cared about patients. Now I kind of worked in nonprofits for a long time. And then I realized I wanted to work at a nonprofit. And so I started working at the National Hemophilia Foundation and realized that I could continue my patient advocacy journey there. Now I'm the executive director of the New York City Hemophilia chapter. And our organization exists to create community to improve health outcomes for patients living with hemophilia in the New York City area.
Thanks, Jeremy. Important work that you're doing there. And Dr. Jay Barth, Chief Medical Officer at Lexeo Therapeutics. Jay, tell us a little bit about yourself while you're here.
Sure. Thanks, Alice. As you said, I'm Jay Barth. I'm Chief Medical Officer at Lexeo Therapeutics. I'm a physician by training, but moved into drug development in pharmaceutical biotech companies over 20 years ago. And that's really what I've been devoted to since then, working across many different therapeutic areas, but focused in rare disease and more recently in gene therapy. And Lexeo has a startup gene therapy company for about a year or so ago, spun out of research based at Cornell from Dr. Ron Crystal's lab, and focused in cardiac and neurologic disorders, and trying to find the best treatments for them via the gene therapy modality. And I think a recurring theme across my career in drug development has been the partnership with patients and patient organizations to really have an effective approach to developing treatments and introducing them to the patient community. So I'm very happy to be here today.
Great. And let me also take a moment to thank our NewYorkBIO organizers for not only this conference, but also pulling together this panel. I think what you're seeing is tremendous diversity, not only in terms of the organizations that we represent, but the perspectives and the touch points that we have with patients. I forgot to mention that the reason I came to American Cancer Society was actually because I had served as a volunteer. So Jeremy, your work is tremendously important because, we're not single story people. We all can play a role in terms of educating our own communities, our own families about the state of science, about, what we're striving to achieve. And in the case of, some of our organizations, we've been deeply involved in the early investments of the foundational science that led way to where we are today. And in the case of American Cancer Society, one of the largest non-governmental nonprofit funders of cancer research, and I know we're talking more broadly than cancer, $5 billion since invested in cancer research funding since its founding in 1946, 49 Nobel laureates. We've been involved in some of the earliest science behind immunotherapy since the 1970s. And imagine it's 50 years later that we're finally seeing truly, this movement, this explosion of the discovery being translated into applications and products that are now readily available, but not to everyone. And that is one of the challenges that we have to overcome. And then even today, as an impact investor within BrightEdge, we have both gene therapy and CAR T therapies within our portfolio. And so I think, what we're, trying to do here is really cover all bases. Even at American Cancer Society, we were advocating for Medicare coverage of CAR T therapies. There is so much work for our entire community to do in terms of finding those areas and those pockets of shared mission. But the first piece is really to address what I would call, the knowledge gap that still exists. And so, as many of you know, just in the last decade, despite the work having been ongoing for many, many years before that, new cell, gene, and tissue engineered therapies have just been rapidly entering the marketplace to treat various cancers, inherited diseases, and different chronic conditions. And what comes with that are a number of social and ethical and health economic issues around how patients, carers, and their public really play a role, not only in the individual care pathway, but also the system level strengthening that has to happen. And recently, a paper from the UK was released that highlighted some of the key knowledge or engagement areas that were most at risk. And topics like the risk of infection from donated genes and cells, expectations of the benefit from therapy and understanding the treatment risk, the engagement with clinicians, the timeframes for the translations of products from research to clinical application, clinical research, what does that mean versus routine clinical application, and then also unlicensed versus licensed use of cell and gene therapies. I mean, these are just some examples of what's swirling out there. And if we all agree that at the end of the day, even with the best science coming out of the labs, even with the best providers, that patient engagement is critical for us to achieve the outcomes that we saw in the research setting, not just understanding the disease state, but also what the treatment options are, and then being engaged and accountable as a member of the care delivery team, right? Because that means that they have to adhere to the treatments, they have to understand the risks and benefits, they have to take an active role. Then how are we, as a community, able to narrow that gap? And that's what I want to start the panel with today, is really, to talk first just about education and what kind of education is really needed and whose role is it to educate. And so maybe let's start, with Terrell. You mentioned that you worked in the front lines. You were there, in different capacities, both as at the health system level and then now for a company. Tell us a little bit about how you've been approaching patient education and how that's changed over time.
Yeah, thank you. So I am a registered nurse, and so working frontline with patients is my passion, and so on top of that, educating them is very important, as you just mentioned, but it's multi-level in my perspective. It doesn't just start with the bedside education aspect of it. It doesn't matter what specific type of therapy it may be. It's because the stress may be high during that experience. So it's important to talk to family and also be able to create materials that can relate, whether it's language, whether it's whatever the case may be. But it's important to drive home and also get important feedback from your audience to make sure that they understand as well. And don't stop until you get that feedback, because when people go home, when they leave, when the patients go home, it's important for them to adhere to whatever therapy it may be, whether it's getting contact with your doctor, if you feel a certain way with a fever from a therapy you may have received, or whatever the case may be. That's my perspective.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeremy, patient organizations are sometimes the first place people go as soon as they get a diagnosis. They go straight to the website. They may have been exposed, especially if it's an inherited disease, through family members, and their involvement. So tell me a little bit about how you all are thinking of your role in patient education engagement when it comes to CAR T and gene therapy.
Thanks, Alice. I know you were mentioning this idea of the gap, and before we came into this room, we were all talking about how long the work has been going on with gene therapy. We talk a lot about how this is new and exciting and all that, but in many ways, this stuff has been going on for a long time. And I would love to say to you today that we have no gaps. It's all great, but there are still some significant gaps. And as an organization, one of the things that I think is allowing people to see that this is real science that's really going to be here soon, and that is available. I was talking to someone the other day who had gone through one of the hemophilia gene therapies, and they said whenever they, sure, they've been reading about it or whatever, but it always felt like a pipe dream promise that they were making to parents that like, someday. And this last year, he went through it, and sitting there in that moment, this is a very well-educated individual who's been to all the conferences, know this stuff, but still that moment of sitting there and realizing, oh my gosh, this therapy is real and available to me, and I'm going to have to make this decision. So, one of the biggest gaps I see is that. Also, in terms of just innovation in general, one of the things that we work on is educating people that they have to take an active role in innovation. That involves kind of goal setting, this sense of like where they want to go as a patient, what they want to accomplish, and then also realizing that innovation doesn't happen because you said it happens because you agree to be a part of it. We all have to play a role in it. So that's one of the ways we're going about it.
That's great. Thanks, Jeremy. Jay, I mean, you have been a clinician and involved in research. we're really trying to address a number of different disease types. We're also talking about cell and gene therapy, sometimes interchangeably. While, one may be the vehicle for delivery, the actual technology is significantly different. And many of us know of people who've received bone marrow transplantation that was a cell therapy done, cure. So tell us a little bit more about, what you're thinking in terms of truly the sort of scientific differentiation across the technology platforms as well as the disease states, and how do we get to a baseline level of understanding, and when do some of those conversations start to diverge?
Well, I think you hit on a key point here initially, which is education. We're talking about novel therapies, even though they have been around for a while. They're still, relatively speaking, new, and people have a lot of questions about them. Both people affected by disease, their families, and other caregivers. And I think the partnership that's involved here is critical between patients and patient organizations, physicians, and the companies that are producing new therapies, pharmaceutical or biotech companies, to really work together to get the word out in terms people can understand about what are these technologies, what's the scientific basis for them, what are the common elements, what's different about them, what are the potential benefits and possible risks of these therapies. I work in an area called in vivo gene therapy, which is transferring genes via a viral particle. There are many other methodologies. People hear about gene editing, cell therapy, et cetera. And although there are, as I said, some common elements, I think really being able to explain to those that are most affected by these new technologies exactly what we're talking about in ways that they can understand. And that will encourage patients, because they're so critical to successfully developing new treatments, of having that engagement, having patients participate in clinical trials, which is so critical, having patients understand and make informed decisions about whether to accept a new treatment once it's available commercially. And I think that has to be done from a position of being informed and educated.
That's great. And I think I can now come back to Jarrell in terms of the listening and the feedback loop, right? So it's no good to keep pushing information out, especially when the science is rapidly changing and it needs to be customized for that particular use case, if you will. So Jarrell, tell us a little bit about what you're hearing on the ground. Like what are the common themes in terms of, the interest for more information, more, sort of subject matter material, sort of patient receptivity, and kind of if we had a magic wand and we could, sort of impart that level of health literacy or scientific literacy, what would that look like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So based on my research, fear has been wrapped around a lot of new therapies. And what is CAR T? What is gene therapy? And I keep going back to that education piece. And it does start with the primary providers, the nurses that are there taking care of the patients, and also at home as well. So I believe that a lot of times just the lack of knowledge equals fear, the fear of the unknown about this new therapy. And in the world we live in today, there's a lot of fear about everything that's going on in society. And I think that's one of the primary things that I've read in my research. And on the ground, when I'm working out in the field, I feel that a lot of the institutions that I've encountered or worked with, they've done a really good job with the patient education and finding the appropriate subjects per se, and also educating them, getting them consented in an appropriate manner, which also consents obviously boils down to the education of that particular therapy that subject or patient will be administered. So to answer your question, Alice, I think that fear is one of the biggest things that I've heard in my experience. And I feel that as we work together as institutions, as sponsors, educating and engaging on whichever level that is appropriate for that subject or patient is important.
Right. Thank you. Jeremy, coming from the hemophilia side, which is more indication specific, and also there are other treatment options out there, tell us a little bit about what you're hearing and how you've been able to sort of meet the needs of your community where they're at right now.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to play off what Jarrell was saying in the sense of fear too, just because it's interesting how fear also drives decisions, but it also drives misinformation that exists out there, and so in our space, hemophilia is unique as a condition. I think we're set up really well to help a lot of other rare diseases, as a lead in this. But also the community as a whole, back to, I mentioned that I had an advocacy role with HIV and AIDS before. Our community was hit really hard with medicines that ended up causing a big portion of the community to get HIV and AIDS because of the way that the medicine was made. So there's a lot of fear and distrust that exists from the community standpoint that is long-term. And so an uptake in this space requires a lot of level of confidence. Just recently, we were really close to getting an approved gene therapy, and it kind of got delayed a year. And so then you start having rumors about well, why is it delayed? What's really going on? I think the uptake or the ultimate role of innovation and how it's going to happen is having some folks be willing to take that risk and believe in the ability it's going to have for the future. So far, the folks I've seen that have raised their hand and said, yes, I want to be a part of this, they're looking not only for themselves, but they're looking for the future. They're looking for their nephews, and they're trying to do something for the greater good by doing this. And then once those stories come out of how it affects them, at least in our community, that's going to be the key. It's going to be those real people telling real stories to build that level of trust.
Thank you. I mean, those are both really complementary and compelling perspectives. Jay, part of the fear factor is I think you bundled into your first opening comments is just, that the science is rapidly changing. There's lots of different types of technologies that are embedded into this thing. The system is not yet, the infrastructure isn't quite there yet to fully deliver. So, at least in your current capacity from a research standpoint, what can you share with the patient communities around some of the safeguards, some of the standards, some of the, to help build confidence that this is truly something that the entire sort of innovation ecosystem is really coming around, turning the corner. And this is not, we are in a place where we really are able to deliver on the promise of the science if we can get the patients to better engage.
Mm-hmm. I think, anytime there is something new in science and technology, there will be concerns about it. And we want to make sure that people's fears are allayed. And I think that comes through transparency and really listening closely to what those concerns are. But I have to say, in the case of gene therapy and in whatever form it takes in areas of oncology or hemophilia or other disorders as well, nothing is done without very, very close scrutiny from organizations like the FDA, for example. There aren't companies going off and just doing some things on their own. There are standards, there are requirements, there are guidances that any company or organization that's working in these new fields have to follow, because first and foremost comes patient safety. Of course, we hope to find something that will cure or at least have a significant benefit and improve lives. That's our goal. That's our mission. But first and foremost, and in medicine we say first do no harm. We absolutely have to pay attention to safety first, and we always do. And there's a careful progression that is followed in the type of testing that's done, from the test tube to animal testing till the point it gets into patients. That has to be and is always followed very closely to really do our best to ensure patient safety. And my utmost respect goes out to those individuals affected by these disorders who are willing to be involved in clinical trials at an early stage because there are still some unknowns. But it's that type of engagement when we start speaking to the communities early with transparency that we do, have those individuals who are not always, as Jeremy was saying, looking out for themselves, but for the future. It's very selfless. How can they do something that could benefit the wider, patient community? And it's really incredible what they do. And that goes back to the partnership we have with the patients.
Thank you. So let me change the format a little bit and throw out a combination of questions I have, as well as some that have come through the chat. And so anyone can answer this one, but, when we think about what, today are the needs of the patient, whether they are in a trial setting or in a sort of commercial product setting or an institutional sort of service setting, how are we thinking about the needs of the patients? There's a lot of sort of, again, variation across the different types of cell and gene therapy. And so, one comment that's come up is, won't people who get CAR T have to be permanently immunosuppressed? But also is some of the logistical challenges required, and whether or not they, physically can get access to cell therapy based on where they live. So, does anyone want to chime in on, when we think of tackling what is really needed to support patients, given the health system is where it's at now, given the understanding is where it's at now, how do we sort of prioritize and really pick, those enabling ways to support the patients?
I can answer from my perspective. I feel that it's important for the patients to know that the sponsors or companies that are producing these medications have advocates on board, like government affairs, different patient advocate settings, or departments, I should say, that are working with legislators and lawmakers to help try to change the language. And in addition to that, there are different trials that are out there that are community-based trials versus just institutional-based trials, where we can actually go out into the community and give particular CAR T or gene therapy infusions per se. So I feel that to allude back to that confidence factor, just know that there are departments within these institutions that are working hard to get the message out there for them in those ways.
Great, thanks. Jay.
If I could add to that, when I think about, the ways in which we, in a biotech setting or a pharmaceutical setting, engage patients, it's really at every step along the way. We don't want to have a situation where suddenly this new treatment appears on the market and now trying to introduce it to, the patient community. It's really from the earliest point in time where, it's even at a concept stage that patients are engaged. We always have patient advisory boards that help guide us. How do we meet the needs of patients? What kind of things are patients looking for? And that's from the earliest point, and then all the way through patients and patient groups and families are part of that process. We're in the information age, and I think just sharing the information that we have as much as we're able to really helps promote that partnership that's so critical to the success. And success means getting new treatments to patients.
I'll just add on that, kind of bouncing off what Jay was saying, that base understanding of what the patients need is probably, most critical, like in their life, what would change their life. I have a family here locally whose hemophilia there's been a lot of development. So lots of new treatments have come up, but there are still some that when I was asking them about their treatment journey, I asked them to draw a postcard of what their treatment journey was right now. If they were going to send a postcard to someone, and their picture was a Band-Aid, and that's all it was. That was their real moment of what they felt like. So what else is there? What do you do for that mom or that family that is still living in fear and anxiety, always feeling like something is going to not go well? I think that for the way we communicate to patients as these new treatments are coming out, making sure we're using language that is universal and not marketing speak, It's interesting whenever we have different companies coming to the market, they want to differentiate. Oh, we've got this, so we're going to use this fancy term for it. That's not going to work for the patients. And then just making sure that when we're presenting, we're not overly polishing and we're talking in a fact-based way.
Absolutely, and maybe I can just chime in from from my own experience and at Bright Edge. American Cancer Society sort of thinks with a system level lens, right? We are not a single manufacturer, we're not a single institution, and so we have, I think, really unparalleled knowledge of what is the problem of cancer, whether it's at a biological level, if it's at a system, health system level, patient, payer, provider level. And one thing that I hope Bright Edge can do as we get involved, as an investor with early stage companies is start to bring some of that late stage knowledge earlier. So we have more patient-centric design conversations when it's easy to embed that into the product characteristics. And Jay, to your point, we don't want these technologies to be so disruptive that we end up imploding the healthcare system. So line of sight is so important, right? We don't want to wait until a product is FDA approved and then patients can't access it in order for payers to then begin the conversation around how could we get access. We don't want to be working on potential cures to then only have blight after the product, is approved because we can't get the payment and the reimbursement mechanism sorted out. These are things that we should already begin anticipating and having conversations in partnership with patients, because as we all know, the healthcare insurance products are putting more accountability, financial, economic accountability on patients. And so they will also be very much in direct line of sight in terms of the procurement and the consumption and the adoption. And so, I think Jennifer's on, but we are going to just take one more question from the audience. And that is, so many of these therapies are developed for children. How do we think about the way we talk to patients, meaning the children, versus their caregivers, the parents who may be the decision makers? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Well, I'm happy to start. I said I'm a physician originally. My background's in pediatrics. So, of course, one has to discuss the issues, both with the patients directly, even if they're children, at the level that they can understand and appreciate, as well as the parents. It's really a team effort between the provider and children and the parents and the adult caregivers to make sure everybody has a similar understanding, even if you have to use different language to get the points across, but to get everybody on the same page, as it were. So clearly we want to engage both children themselves and their adult caregivers.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Jay. Well, with that, I want to thank our esteemed panelists for joining us today and sharing your various perspectives and across all these different disease states. I'm still very optimistic about what this field is going to do in this decade and for decades to come. I think what we tried to highlight was the fact that, the investments in scientific research, translation, and then now into product development and commercialization, they take time, but they also take, really a community leaning in early. And in this environment with patient engagement being a critical factor for success, we can all do more to help educate, to help build awareness, but also to work in partnership to help pave way for the system level strengthening, for the science to ultimately reach the patients, and for, broader communities to benefit. So with that, I want to thank the panel, thank all of you for participating, and hand it over to Jennifer Bland to close us out.
Thank you for joining us for NewYorkBIO's first Patient Engagement Summit. All of the panels from the event can be found online on NewYorkBIO's YouTube channel, and we hope they will be shared and heard. We want to thank our sponsors and our partners for coming together to help build an exceptional event, and we hope to see you next year at what will be our second annual Patient Engagement Summit. Until then,